Senator JD Vance aimed to put Representative Jasmine Crockett on the defensive with a calculated question. What followed, however, was a direct and pointed reply he hadn't anticipated. The hearing room wasn't loud, but it buzzed with the kind of quiet anticipation that comes when cameras are on, and every sentence could become tomorrow's headline. The official topic was federal housing reform, but many in that room knew the real agenda was political leverage and control. Jasmine. Crockett adjusted her microphone, leaned in slightly, and immediately sensed the kind of moment she was walking into. Across from her sat Senator JD Vance, his hair neatly combed, tie loosened just enough to seem casual but deliberate. He had that confident posture that many seasoned politicians carry when they believe they've already won the argument. Vance wasn't speaking yet, but his eyes were locked on her, clearly waiting for his turn. Crockett didn't rush to fill the silence. She had come ready, not just with a binder full of data, but with lived stories and real names, the faces of people unlikely to ever get a seat at this table. She'd flown in the previous night from Dallas, combed through policy notes on the plane, and skipped the pre-hearing staff dinner. None of that mattered anymore. The moment had arrived. Representative Barry Granger from Oregon was mid-sentence, speaking vaguely about modular housing models and innovation funding, when Vance started fidgeting in his chair. It was clear Granger's commentary wasn't what Vance had come for. His eyes repeatedly turned toward Crockett. Finally, as Granger concluded, Vance raised his hand. "Madam Chair," he began smoothly, "I'd like to direct a question to Representative Crockett." Instantly, attention in the room pivoted. The cameras adjusted. A few aides looked up from their devices. Vance kept his tone even. "You've advocated for expanded federal housing funds in cities like Dallas," he said. "But how do you justify that when those cities deal with ongoing violence, poor management, and persistent homelessness? Wouldn't more federal funding just support continued failure under your leadership?" The words weren't loud, but their meaning was unmistakable. The implication was cities, especially those with significant black and brown populations, are dysfunctional, and efforts to help them are pointless. He knew the weight of what he was saying. Crockett didn't immediately react. She took a sip of water, set the bottle down gently, and met the moment with calm clarity. She didn't raise her voice or show irritation, but the firmness in her tone made it clear. She was ready. "Senator," she began, "I'm glad you brought that up." Some heads turned. The tone of her voice, low, measured, didn't mirror the provocation, but it carried undeniable weight, like someone who had waited a long time for this kind of challenge. "I represent a district where people work multiple jobs and still can't afford a place to live, where schools are falling apart and families are forced to share small spaces, not out of choice, but out of necessity. You say mismanagement," she continued. "I call it disinvestment." She paused, not for drama, but for clarity. "The violence you referenced didn't just appear. It's the product of decades of policy, highways cutting through neighborhoods, redlining that limited opportunities, and then surprise when these problems show up." Still composed, her words landed with weight. "And about federal funds, Dallas sends billions to the federal government every year. Our residents pay taxes. We're not asking for charity. We're asking for what we're owed. If we want to discuss accountability, let's examine where the money does go." Vance shifted in his seat. Not dramatically, but enough for those watching closely to notice. Crockett picked up on it, but she wasn't rushing. She knew the most impactful point was still ahead. Vance let out a dry chuckle, an attempt to show composure. He tapped the table gently with his fingers before leaning in again. "Well, Representative," he said in that same composed tone, "you've brought up historical injustices like redlining and urban infrastructure. But it's the year 2025. When will today's city leaders take responsibility? Are we still pointing to the past instead of fixing what's in front of us?" This wasn't new. It was a standard deflection, call for accountability, but only in one direction. The kind of line that gets applause from partisan rooms and shrugs elsewhere. But this wasn't that kind of room. And Crockett wasn't that kind of representative. She didn't blink. "You want to talk about responsibility?" she asked. Then let's do that. Crockett opened her binder and pulled out a page. Small font, highlighted text. Holding it up not to make a spectacle, but to show she'd come equipped with evidence. This is a federal report from 2023, she said. It shows that the states with the highest poverty levels are largely rural. It highlights that access to clean water, health care, and safe housing isn't just an urban issue. It's happening in Appalachia, in the Mississippi Delta, in towns like Ross County, Ohio. She looked directly at Senator Vance. That's your state, right? He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew. You want to talk about leadership? She continued. Let's do that. Because while you're questioning city officials, your own constituents are living in trailers with black mold, with no running water, and in some cases, without consistent electricity. And when Congress voted on a bill to help them, you opposed it. Some eyebrows lifted in the back rows. A staffer scribbled rapidly on a notepad. Vance adjusted his mic. With all due respect, he said, those problems are layered. A single bill won't solve rural poverty, just as one grant won't fix housing issues in cities. Crockett remained calm and firm. But when you question the competence of leaders based solely on their zip code, especially when those zip codes belong to people of color, you're not proposing solutions. You're avoiding responsibility for your own voting record. She hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her steady tone gave every word strength. On social media, someone was already sharing her remarks. A short clip of the last 30 seconds made its way onto Twitter with the caption, "Crockett didn't flinch." But inside the hearing room, this wasn't about social media trends. It was about lives. People like Miss Leona in South Dallas, who had contacted Crockett's office every week for 3 months, trying to resolve her Section 8 paperwork. Or Carlos, a high school student living in his aunt's van, trying to complete final exams while sleeping in a parking lot. These were the people who didn't get hearings or headlines, but who bore the brunt of policy decisions made in this room. Crockett reached into her folder again, this time pulling out a photograph. A 2-story home in poor condition. Faded paint, sagging roof, a blue tarp weighed down with bricks. This house is in Chillicothe, Ohio. Not Dallas, she explained. A woman named Terry lives there. She's 61. Her heater stopped working 2 winters ago, and now she uses the oven for heat. She recently told a reporter, "They always talk about the big cities, but nobody ever asks about us." Crockett looked at Vance again, her tone even softer. People like Terry and Miss Leona, they're not against each other. But when you use hearings like this to pit urban and rural communities against one another, that's exactly what you create. She leaned back slightly in her chair. "I didn't come here to perform," she said. "I came to work." The real shift in the hearing, however, was still ahead. Senator Vance stayed silent for a moment. He shifted in his chair again, not dramatically, but noticeably. Someone coughed near the back of the room. Crockett remained motionless, letting the silence sit longer than most people in politics can tolerate. Then she leaned forward again. "I won't stand here and say cities don't have challenges," she said. "They do, but let me say something very clearly. Poverty isn't a reflection of moral weakness. It's not the result of laziness or poor leadership. It's a direct outcome of policies, of decisions made by people who have never had to live with the consequences." She opened her folder again, now moving with intention. Each section was neatly labeled, color-coded, organized. "I brought numbers," she said, tapping one document, "since we seem to trust data more when it comes from think tanks. Let's talk eviction rates. Dallas ranks among the highest in the country. But it's not because people don't want to pay their rent, it's because their wages haven't kept up. Median rent in my district is $1,450 a month. A full-time minimum wage worker earns about $2,200. Do the math." A quiet murmur rose from the back rows. Not applause, but recognition. People were calculating those numbers in their heads. The mood in the room started shifting. Not necessarily toward her, not necessarily against Vance, but toward the reality she had drawn clearly. "And let's not forget," she added, "these same families still get their utilities shut off. Their children still get sick from mold. When they seek help, they get waitlisted Because the federal funds they depend on are gone, redirected elsewhere, to places that don't look like them. She paused, not for drama, but to let the truth settle. I know what this looks like, Crockett continued. I've seen it, I've lived parts of it. My mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning homes during the day and stocking shelves at night. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted a roof that didn't leak and a doctor who would see her without a 6-week wait. Her voice remained calm, but it carried more depth now. She wasn't reading anymore. She was speaking from memory. I went to a public school that lost its accreditation, twice. You know what our government said? They'd review the funding in 2 years. 2 years is someone's freshman and sophomore years gone. Try explaining that to a parent watching their kid fall behind. Crockett noticed Vance glance down at his notes. She didn't stop. This hearing isn't about assigning blame, she said. It's about whether we're serious about fixing things or just trying to win arguments. Because let me be clear, no one in my district is tuning in to see who lands a good soundbite. They're checking to see if their housing voucher got approved. Senator Pauline Marks, seated a few chairs away, scribbled in her notebook but didn't raise her eyes. She didn't have to. The shift in the room was unmistakable. Crockett flipped a page in her binder. And since we're discussing responsibility, she continued, let's stop acting like urban communities brought collapse upon themselves. Have you heard of urban renewal programs from the 1950s and 60s? She asked. Those were federal policies that bulldozed entire neighborhoods, built highways through black communities, displaced families without a plan, and called it progress. What followed was generational housing instability. She leaned forward again, voice quieter now, the kind of quiet that makes people lean in to listen. We didn't ask for the harm. But we've been living with the damage ever since. A silence settled over the room. Not awkward, but thoughtful. People were listening. She wasn't launching attacks. She was explaining what happens when policy decisions are made without empathy. And for once, Vance didn't interrupt. Then Crockett closed her binder for the first time since she'd started speaking. What came next wasn't from reports. It wasn't based on statistics. It was something more personal. You know what frustrates me most, Senator? She asked, eyes fixed on him. It's the narrative. The idea that poverty looks a certain way, that when black and brown communities struggle, it's a failure of leadership. But when white families in rural areas struggle, it's a national crisis. She let that land before she continued. I've been to Athens County and Jackson Township, she said. Not for press or attention, but because poor is poor, whether it's East Dallas or a trailer park outside Zanesville. You say urban leaders need to do better, but what about rural representatives? What about your role? Her voice wasn't loud, but it was persistent, slow and steady. Vance exhaled sharply through his nose and shifted again in his seat. With all due respect. But she held up a hand. No, she said. Let's actually talk about respect. Because I'm tired of these hearings being used to take cheap shots at mayors, community leaders, and single mothers, then turning around and voting against bills that would actually help your own districts. She leaned into the mic slightly. I looked through your voting record last night, she said. You opposed the Rural Housing Stability Assistance Program. That bill would have repaired low-income rentals, helped homeless veterans in small towns and supported families forced out of their homes during the pandemic. You voted no. Now she looked directly at him. You talk about the American dream disappearing from the heartland, but when your voters can't afford heat, you blame bureaucracy. When they die from overdoses in gas station bathrooms, you blame culture. And when someone tries to pass legislation, you call it government overreach. A few quiet gasps rippled through the room. And I want to be clear, she said. I'm not using anyone's pain for political gain. I'm recognizing it. Because they deserve better too. But if we're going to sit here and act like one kind of poverty is a political risk, and another is a reason for action, then we're not being honest. We're just reinforcing old biases. Vance reached for his pen, hesitated, and set it down again. He glanced toward the chairwoman, perhaps hoping for an interjection. None came. Crockett wasn't done. I once met a man in Jackson, Ohio, Crockett continued. His name was Ronnie. He was 71, used to work in a steel mill. Lost his pension when the company folded. Now he lives off canned beans, peanut butter, and whatever's left from Social Security. He told me he's too proud to ask for help, too tired to fight for it. But he was clear about one thing. He didn't care which political party fixed the problem. He just wanted to stop waking up freezing in February. She paused. Ronnie's story isn't so different from people I know in Dallas. The only difference is how we talk about them. We speak about people like Ronnie with sympathy, and people from my district with suspicion. The tension in the hearing room had given way to stillness. No one moved. No one looked away. If we're going to create housing policy that actually helps people, she said, we need to stop dividing people into categories: rural versus urban, white versus black, deserving versus dependent. Those aren't real differences, they're distractions. Still, no one interrupted. But Crockett was about to shift the tone again. This time, even more personally. She looked down briefly, not at her binder, not at any documents, just taking a breath. Then she looked up and the feeling in the room changed. She wasn't responding to a question anymore. She was opening up. I usually don't talk about this in public hearings, she began, because when you share personal stories, people either dismiss you or try to use them against you. But today I will. She leaned forward slightly. I was 13 when we got evicted. My mom worked 6 days a week. My dad had just lost his job at the auto shop. One afternoon we came home from school and our things were out on the lawn. Couch, TV, boxes, just sitting there like none of it mattered. My little brother thought we were moving. He didn't understand what was happening. Now the room was silent. Not politely quiet, but genuinely still. We stayed with my aunt for 2 weeks. Then a neighbor took us in for 3. It was the first time I realized how fragile stability really is. One day, you're fine. The next, you're not. You think hard work keeps you safe until you find a notice taped to your door. She paused again. We eventually found a small apartment. My mom never called it the bad part of town. She'd just say, "It's ours for now." A staffer sitting across the room slowly lowered her pen. Everyone was listening. Years later, I became a public defender. One of my earliest clients was a woman arrested for trespassing, but she wasn't trespassing. She was living in an abandoned house with her 2 kids. She worked nights cleaning offices, dropped her children at school in the morning. She had no address. So technically she was breaking the law. Crockett stopped just briefly. I remember sitting across from her, realizing how little separated us. If one thing in my life had gone differently, I could have been her. Same work ethic, same exhaustion, same look in her eyes. No one in the hearing room shifted. They were locked in. "This," she said, gesturing gently, "this is why I fight. The way I do. Why I show up with numbers and names. Because people don't live in spreadsheets, they live in neighborhoods, in weekly motels, in parked cars with cracked windshields." Senator Vance hadn't moved. His hands were resting on his papers still. "And I want to be clear," Crockett added. "I don't hate rural communities. I've driven through your districts, Senator. I've seen the empty shelves at gas stations, the kids walking a mile to reach the bus stop. You think I don't understand that pain? You think because I fight for urban housing I don't see what's happening there?" She shook her head slightly. "That's the problem. These false divisions convince people their pain is separate. But poverty doesn't care about your zip code. It doesn't care who you voted for. It doesn't check party lines before it hits your doorstep." Her voice softened, but her delivery remained firm. "My mother told me something after we got evicted. She said, 'Don't ever let them shame you for what you had to survive.' That stayed with me, because every time someone tries to mock poor families or use their stories for cheap political gain, I hear her voice." She looked forward again, not at Vance, not at the committee, but toward the cameras. "Every time someone calls public housing a failure, I see my brother sleeping on a stranger's couch. Every time someone says just work harder, I think of my mom, feet blistered from cleaning floors at 3 in the morning. She straightened in her seat. This isn't theoretical for me. It's real, and it's real for millions of others who can't afford to be in this room. So if you're going to question whether those people are worthy of help," Crockett said firmly, You better be prepared for someone to respond. Outside the hearing room, the internet had already taken notice. By the time the session ended, a short clip, just 47 seconds long, had reached 3 million views. It featured Crockett's final comments about eviction, shame, and the meaning of survival. No music, no graphics, just her voice and the quiet around her. A junior staffer had uploaded it on their personal account. Then a news outlet in Columbus reposted it with a simple caption. JD Vance challenged Jasmine Crockett. He wasn't ready. From there, it spread. On TikTok, young people stitched themselves into the clip, nodding slowly, some crying. Others shared their own stories about eviction notices, sleeping on friends' couches, hiding when law enforcement came knocking. They weren't trying to debate. They were remembering. On Twitter, hashtags like Crockett Clapback and She Said It began trending in just a few hours. An Ohio-based housing nonprofit reposted the video with the message, "We've waited years for someone to say this out loud." By the evening news cycle, national anchors were quoting parts of her remarks. Each network had its own take. Some called it a powerful rebuttal, others called it a turning point. But one thing was consistent across coverage. Crockett had changed the tone and the conversation. Meanwhile, Vance's team scrambled to control the narrative. By midnight, they issued a short statement on his official website. "We must work together to improve lives across all communities, urban, rural, and in between. While I may not agree with Representative Crockett's approach, I respect her passion." Was carefully worded, safe, vague, and unlikely to offend. But it didn't land the way they hoped. People flooded the comment section with screenshots of Crockett's quotes, calling out her statistics, her personal stories, her clarity. One commenter summed it up. "She came with evidence. He came with excuses." Back in Dallas, Crockett's office. Phone rang nonstop. People didn't want to argue. They just wanted to say thank you. One woman left a voicemail through tears. "I never thought anyone in Congress understood what it felt like to lose your home." What surprised everyone was the number of responses that came not from her district, but from rural Ohio. Towns like Portsmouth, Circleville, and Chillicothe, places Vance had won handily in the last election, sent messages. One came from a veteran who wrote, "I don't agree with her politics, but everything she said about housing out here was true. We've been forgotten." 2 days after the hearing, Crockett sat with her staff in their small Dallas office. The walls were lined with notes, emails printed out, letters handwritten, all taped up with care. Some were from high school students. One was from a retired pastor who said he'd never voted for a Democrat before, but had changed his mind. Still, Crockett didn't celebrate. "This isn't a win," she told her team. Her aide, Devin, looked up. "Then what is it?" "A reminder," she said, "that people shouldn't have to go viral for their stories to matter. They should have cared when Miss Leona called us 6 months ago. They should have cared when Ronnie's pension disappeared. The cameras weren't there then." Someone in the back asked if they should begin drafting thank you responses to the letters. "We will," she replied. "But we're also going to finish that housing bill we've been working on. And this time, it's going to have some weight behind it." The room grew quiet. The staff, young and driven, knew that something had changed. Not just the public attention, but the urgency. Elsewhere, political commentators were still dissecting every frame of the hearing. Some said Crockett had a future in statewide politics. Others argued she was too bold, too direct for higher office. But inside her office, none of that mattered. The work was still ahead. But the larger lesson, the one that lingered even as headlines moved on, wasn't just about Crockett. It was about the stories she'd told. And the reason they struck a chord was simple: they were true. By the next week, the media buzz had started to slow. Headlines shifted, as they always do. A major tech company collapsed. A senator said something controversial on a podcast. But for many who had really listened to Crockett's words, the moment hadn't passed. It lingered, quietly, persistently, because it wasn't about a political clapback. It wasn't just about one viral exchange in a crowded hearing room. What happened that day revealed something deeper, something that rarely makes it into official debates. That housing policy isn't just about budget lines and numbers. It's a reflection a test, a way for this country to ask itself who is seen as worth helping and who isn't. It's easy to sit behind microphones and throw around statistics, to say things like personal responsibility when everything is abstract. But what Crockett did in that hearing was remove the distance. She didn't just share her own truth. She gave voice to the people who are usually invisible in rooms like that. Her message was simple. America doesn't treat all suffering the same. A white working-class man in rural Ohio is labeled as forgotten. A black working-class woman in South Dallas is labeled a failure. One is given sympathy, the other scrutiny. That's not about numbers or budgets. That's bias. And that bias influences everything, from how money is allocated to how headlines are written. It shapes who gets help and who gets blamed when things go wrong. But Crockett didn't use her story to argue that urban struggles deserve more attention than rural ones. She was clear. Both matter. Both deserve serious investment. Neither should be used as a talking point to discredit the other. She also touched on something few elected officials are willing to say out loud, that many in power benefit from keeping poor communities divided. Because if someone in rural Ohio starts to see their struggle in someone living in South Dallas, then the political games get harder to play. People at the bottom might begin to ask the same tough questions, demand the same accountability, and when that happens, the status quo starts to crack. That's why moments like the hearing mattered. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. They forced everyone watching to ask, who is really being heard in this system? There was a moment the next day that didn't make the news, but it stuck with Crockett. She was flying home, seated in the middle of row 27. To her left, a school teacher from Little Rock. To her right, a contractor from Pittsburgh. No one recognized her. The teacher was reading. The contractor was half asleep. Somewhere over Missouri, the teacher turned and asked, "You live in D.C.?" Crockett smiled. "Sometimes I work there." The woman nodded. "It's loud over there." Crockett replied, "Too loud sometimes. But I try to speak for folks who don't have the mic." The woman studied her for a second and said, "Well, if you're fighting for people who can't afford first class, you're in the right row." They both chuckled lightly. It wasn't a deep or political moment, but it meant something to Crockett because those are the people she was fighting for. Not the ones with access, but the ones trying to survive in economy class. The ones wondering if anyone in D.C. even knows they exist. Crockett had no illusions about being perfect. She said so often, but what made her different that day was her willingness to tell the truth in a room built on performance, and that truth resonated, not because it was loud, but because it was clear. The hearing didn't solve the housing crisis. It didn't immediately change policy, but it reminded people, publicly and powerfully, that their experiences mattered. It told them they weren't alone, and that sometimes is where real change starts, not in legislation but in recognition. The message wasn't flashy. It wasn't crafted for headlines, but it stuck because it spoke to something real. The belief that no matter where you're from, your life should matter just as much as anyone else's. A week after the hearing, Representative Crockett stood outside a modest community center in Lancaster, Texas. There were no cameras, no journalists, just folding chairs, a few clipboards, and a room full of residents with questions about rent, support, building code enforcement, and the chances of a new housing pilot program. Toward the end, a man in his late 60s raised his hand. He wore a worn Dallas Cowboys jacket and scuffed work boots. He didn't ask about funding or legislation. He simply asked, "Do they listen when you talk like that up there?" Crockett didn't respond immediately. She looked at the man, then slowly scanned the room. Faces worn by long days, people who'd likely wondered the same thing more than once. "Not always," she finally said. "But I don't speak to make them comfortable. I speak so you don't feel invisible." And that was the heart of it. The hearing hadn't been about targeting Senator Vance or chasing viral fame. That wasn't the win. The real win was that moment when someone in a small town heard something familiar in a place they never expected to be represented. Crockett hadn't postured or performed. She had simply told the truth. People often forget that politics isn't just about legislation. It's about memory. It's about whose stories are preserved, whose pain is acknowledged, and whose voice is believed. When Crockett talked about eviction or brought up Terry in Ohio and Ronnie with his failing heater, she wasn't acting. She was documenting. She was making sure those lives, often left out of the official record, were finally acknowledged. She wanted people to understand. These conditions aren't coincidences. This poverty isn't background noise. It's real. It's systemic. And whether you live in a red brick apartment in South Dallas or a trailer down a dirt road in Meigs County, your circumstances should matter equally. That was the message that struck a chord, not because it was emotional or strategic, but because it was raw and honest. The kind of honesty that can't be disguised by talking points or buried in vague policy language. The truth is, this country needs more of that, not just in Congress, but wherever real decisions are being made. We need more people willing to say, this system isn't working and we can't pretend it is. And we need to stop treating one type of struggle as more legitimate than another. Whether you were raised in public housing or on a remote farm, you understand what it means to do everything right and still fall short. You know what it feels like to face eviction, to heat your home with an oven, to stay silent when someone knocks because you're behind on rent. And if that sounds like you, or your family, or your childhood, then you already understand why that hearing mattered. Maybe you've never had a microphone. Maybe you've never sat in front of a congressional committee. But you've lived the part that really counts. The long nights, the missed paychecks, the quiet fear when you see a yellow notice taped to your door. And maybe you've waited a long time to hear someone finally say these things out loud in a place where it's usually politics as usual. That's why Crockett's story mattered. Not because she said it best, but because she said what too many people still can't. So here's the ask. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Talk about it. Share it. Ask the people who represent you where they stand, not just for your neighborhood, but for people you'll never meet. Folks living through the same thing in another town, another county, another state. Representation isn't a trend, it's a responsibility. And every time someone like Crockett speaks up, it reminds the rest of us that truth still belongs at the table. If you believe that matters, subscribe, leave a comment, tell your story, and remember, your voice counts, even when they act like it doesn't.